There was a strip of land on the Burkett place that had no business being green. 60 feet wide, running roughly northeast to southwest across the middle of the property, crossing the fence line between the upper pasture and the lower hay ground without following either boundary. In a county where August turned every field the color of cardboard, that strip held its color like a seam of something buried underneath that the rest of the dirt didn't have. Nobody talked about it. Neighbors who drove past the Burkett property twice a day for 30 years saw it without seeing it, the way you stop noticing a crack in your own windshield. Ellen Burkett's father had farmed around it his whole life without once asking what made it different. Her brother, who took over the cattle operation after their father died, mowed right over it and never mentioned the grass came up thicker there than anywhere else on the property. Ellen noticed.
She noticed the way some people notice a painting hung slightly crooked in a room full of people who've stopped seeing it, not because she was smarter, but because she was the kind of person who couldn't stop looking at things that didn't add up. And for 9 years, she looked at that green line, walked it, measured it, mapped it, and said almost nothing about it to anyone, because she didn't have an answer yet, only a question that kept getting louder. What she eventually found beneath that strip of grass would reshape not just her own farm, but the way 3 neighboring properties managed water for the next decade. But she didn't find it by digging. She found it in a filing cabinet in the basement of the county library, on a map that nobody had unfolded in 60 years. If you've ever noticed something everyone else walked past and couldn't let it go, stay with us. We tell stories like this one every week.
Ellen Burkett was 53 and had been back on the family land for 6 years, where the green strip first became more than a curiosity. She'd returned to Harlan County after 22 years in Omaha, where she'd worked as a land title researcher for a regional law firm, a job that consisted entirely of reading old documents and finding things other people had missed. When her brother's health forced him off the property, she came back, not because she loved farming, but because there was no one else, and because the land had been in the family since 1921. The farm was 160 acres of mixed-use ground in south-central Nebraska, dry country even in good years, the kind of place where irrigation was the difference between a crop and a tax bill. Ellen didn't irrigate.
She couldn't afford the pivot system her brother had talked about for years but never installed. And the county's groundwater allocation was already stretched thin from center pivot corn operations that had been pulling the Ogallala aquifer down faster than it could recover. So she ran cattle on the upper pasture and cut hay on the lower ground and watched the seasons come and go. And every August, she watched that green strip hold its color while everything around it faded. The first year she measured it, she used 100-foot tape and a handful of survey flags from the hardware store in town. 62 feet wide at the widest point, narrowing to about 40 near the northeast corner of the property. She wrote the numbers in a pocket notebook she'd been keeping since Omaha, the same one she used for title chains and deed discrepancies, and drew a rough map on the inside back cover. The second year, she started testing soil, not professionally, not with lab equipment, but with a garden trowel and her own hands. The soil inside the green strip was darker, looser, cooler to the touch even in the heat of July. It held together differently when she squeezed it, crumbling the way good soil does instead of packing into a hard, dry lump. She dug down 18 inches in 3 places along the strip and in 3 places 20 feet outside it. Inside, her trowel hit moisture at 14 inches. Outside, the ground was dry as chalk all the way down. She told her brother about it once, on a phone call that winter. He said the strip had always been there. Their father had called it the good seam, and that was the end of the conversation. But Ellen had spent 22 years in a job where "it's always been that way" was never an answer. It was a starting point. By the 5th year, she had enough data points in her notebook to see a pattern she couldn't explain with surface features alone.
The strip didn't follow any irrigation line. It didn't follow the fence. It didn't follow the property boundary, or the county road, or the slope of the land. It ran on its own line, northeast to southwest, as if something underneath the surface was drawing it, something older than the farm itself. The county library in Alma was a 1-story brick building that smelled like carpet glue and old paper. Ellen had been there twice to look up deed records when she first came back, and she remembered a filing cabinet in the basement marked County Surveys, Historical. She drove down on a Tuesday morning in March of her 7th year on the farm, not sure what she was looking for, only that the surface of her own land wasn't going to tell her anything new. The cabinet held 14 drawers of county soil surveys, geological reports, and hand-drawn maps going back to the 1930s. Most of them were cataloged loosely, by decade.
Ellen started with the oldest drawer and worked forward. It took her 3 visits over 2 weeks to find the one that mattered. A soil conservation survey from 1941, commissioned by the county after a series of dust storms and produced by the Soil Conservation Service, the agency that would later become the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The survey included a hand-drawn topographic overlay of the entire south section of the county, showing drainage patterns, soil types, and, critically, the original waterways that had existed before large-scale cultivation reshaped the land. Running northeast to southwest across what was now the Burkett property, drawn in faded blue ink with the notation intermittent tributary, dry channel, was a creek bed. Not the modern creek that ran along the county road a quarter-mile east, an older one, a seasonal waterway that had once carried snowmelt and storm runoff across the exact line where Ellen's green strip now grew.
The map showed it clearly, unmistakably, in a position that matched her own hand-drawn map within a margin she estimated at no more than 10 feet. The creek hadn't disappeared. It had been buried. Decades of tillage, erosion, and soil movement had filled the channel with sediment, covering it with 8 to 14 inches of topsoil that looked identical to everything around it. But underneath, the old gravel bed of that creek still existed, and it was doing exactly what a creek bed does, holding water, moving it slowly, releasing it upward through capillary action during dry months, feeding the roots above it from below, the way a wick feeds a flame. Ellen sat in the basement of that library for a long time, holding a 60-year-old map in her hands, understanding for the first time what her land had been trying to tell her since the day she came back. The green strip wasn't a mystery. It was a buried creek, doing what buried creeks do. The question was no longer why that strip was green. The question was whether she could make the rest of her farm do the same thing. She photocopied the map, drove home, and started reading about Keyline design. Keyline design is an approach to land management developed in the 1950s by an Australian farmer and engineer named Percival Yeomans. The core idea is deceptively simple. Instead of fighting the natural movement of water across a landscape, you work with it, using shallow, contour-following channels called swales to capture runoff and spread it laterally across a hillside, moving water from the wet valleys where it naturally concentrates to the dry ridges where it's needed most. On Ellen's property, the buried creek bed was the valley, the natural low point where water had always collected. Everything else was ridge, and the ridges were dying every August while the valleys stayed green. Keyline design offered a way to extend the creek's effect outward, not by pumping water or building ditches, but by cutting shallow furrows along the contour lines of her land, angled slightly off contour so that water hitting them during a rain would slow down, spread sideways, and soak in instead of running straight downhill and off the property. She started with a single test, 3 swales, each roughly 200 feet long and 8 inches deep, cut with a rented subsoiler on a borrowed tractor along the slope above the western edge of the green strip. Total cost? $240 in equipment rental and a weekend of work. The swales looked like nothing, shallow grooves in the pasture, barely visible from the road. The first real rain came 3 weeks later, a late spring storm that dropped 1.25 inches in 2 hours. Ellen stood at the kitchen window watching the water run, and her stomach sank. The runoff hit the first swale and pooled, exactly as it should. But the second swale overtopped within minutes, sending a muddy tongue of water straight across the slope and into the neighbor's drainage ditch. She'd cut the second channel too shallow, and the angle was wrong by what she later measured to be about 3 degrees. She spent 2 days recutting the failed swale, deeper this time, adjusting the angle with a hand level she'd ordered from a farm supply catalog. The correction was small, the difference was not. The second storm, in early June, hit harder than the first, 2 inches in 90 minutes. This time the water hit the 3 swales in sequence, slowed, spread laterally, and soaked into the slope instead of running off. Ellen walked the swale lines that evening and pushed her trowel into the ground 10 feet downslope of the middle channel. Damp soil at 8 inches in a spot that had been dry as chalk at the same depth 3 months earlier. It wasn't proof yet. One rain doesn't make a pattern. But her notebook was filling up, and the numbers were starting to point in one direction. She cut 4 more swales that summer, extending the system further from the green strip, each one adjusted based on what the last rain had taught her. Each one, a small bet placed against the same question. Could she teach water to go where the old creek no longer reached? The answer came the following August, and it came the way answers in farming always come. Not in a laboratory, but in the dirt, under a sun that didn't care about anyone's theory. That summer brought the driest stretch Harlan County had recorded in 9 years. 7 weeks without measurable rain, from late June through mid-August. The Ogallala-fed pivot systems kept the corn operations alive, but dryland pastures across the county turned the color of straw by the end of July.
Ellen's upper pasture, the ground above the green strip where she hadn't yet cut swales, went brown on schedule, the way it always had. But the lower slope, the 7 acres where she'd spent 14 months cutting and adjusting her swale network, held. Not perfectly, not the deep green of the buried creek bed itself, but visibly, unmistakably greener than the surrounding ground. Grass that should have gone dormant by the 3rd week of July was still showing color in the 2nd week of August. Her cattle, given the choice, grazed the swale zone and ignored the upper pasture entirely, the way animals do when they can feel the difference under their hooves, even if they can't explain it. Her neighbor to the west, a man named Dale Koenig, who had farmed the adjacent section for 25 years, drove past one afternoon in early August, stopped his truck, and walked to the fence line.
He stood there for a while, looking at the color difference between his pasture and Ellen's lower slope, the kind of difference you can see from a moving vehicle at 40 miles an hour. "What are you putting on that ground?" he asked. "Water," Ellen said. "There hasn't been water in 7 weeks. "There has if you caught it in May." She walked him along the swale lines that afternoon, showing him where the water had pooled, soaked in, and moved laterally into soil that had never held moisture past June. She showed him the 1941 map, still folded in her notebook, the blue ink line of the buried creek running beneath both their properties. Because it did. The old tributary didn't stop at Ellen's fence. It crossed into Koenig's northeast quarter and continued for at least another 800 feet before the map's coverage ended. Koenig looked at the map, looked at his own parched pasture, and said nothing for a long time. "That creek runs under my place, too." "It does. And you think these ditches can pull water off the creek line and spread it out?" "They're not ditches. They're swales. And I don't think it. I've watched it happen for 14 months. He asked if she'd help him lay out a test section on his side of the fence. She said yes before he finished asking. By the following spring, Koenig had cut his own swale network on 12 acres of his northeast quarter, following the contour of the old creek bed that Ellen's map had revealed. A second neighbor, a younger woman running a hay operation north of the Burkett property, asked Ellen to walk her land that winter after hearing about the green strip from Koenig at the co-op. Ellen found no buried creek on that property, but she identified 2 natural drainage lines where swales could capture runoff that was currently leaving the land entirely. They cut them together over a weekend.
The county extension agent, the same one Ellen had never called and who had never called her, drove out in October after hearing enough talk at the Farm Bureau meeting to get curious. He walked the swale network, studied the 1941 map, took soil moisture readings at 6 points along and outside the swale lines, and left without saying much. 2 months later, he published a short article in the county agricultural newsletter about low-cost, passive water management techniques for dry land operations. He didn't name Ellen. He didn't need to. Everyone in the county already knew whose land he was writing about. Ellen still walks the green strip most mornings, the way she has since the year she came back. Her notebook has more pages in it now, and the maps inside it have grown from a single hand-drawn sketch to a layered overlay of the 1941 survey, her own soil moisture data, the swale network, and the contour lines she's still learning to read.
She never did find out exactly when the old creek stopped flowing on the surface, or how many decades of plowing it took to bury it. Some questions don't have clean endings. What she knows is that the water never left. It just went underground, and the land kept marking where it was, year after year, in a line of green that nobody thought to ask about, until one person couldn't stop looking at it. Most of what we call discovery is really just attention that outlasted everyone else's patience. The land had been speaking for 60 years. Ellen was the first person who stayed quiet long enough to hear what it was saying. If this story reminded you that the answers are often already there, waiting for someone patient enough to notice, subscribe and stay with us, and tell us, has your own land or your own life ever shown you something that took years to understand?